When I was about 11 years old, my family and I lived in a large one-story house in the Wisconsin countryside. We lived on the top of a small hill, and the back of our house faced a large forested area. We only had one neighbour within a 4-mile radius, and it was this old woman who couldn't really get around by herself. On this particular night, my parents were having a date night and had left me to watch my 2 siblings. I definitely still think I was too young for this. They had given me my first phone at 9 years old, so that I could watch my siblings while they weren't home. I remember it was fall because I had my windows open in my bedroom to keep my room cooler at night, and I could constantly hear all the leaves brushing against each other outside. My parents had probably left about 8 p.m, already put my little brother, who's 6, to bed. At this time, my brother had a huge fear of the dark and would refuse to leave his room after someone put him in bed and turned off his lights. He used to tell us that he thought someone would grab him from under the bed and pull him down if he tried to get up. My room was on the opposite side of the house as his. It shared a wall with the kitchen and mudroom. My sister had been sleeping in my room since we moved to this house, and by the time this happened, she was already asleep next to me. I remember being scared to fall asleep for some reason. I think I was just nervous not having my parents at home, but around 9:30 p.m, I started to hear crunching leaves outside my window. At first, it was quite distant. It sounded like maybe an animal in the woods, but then it got closer to the house and my windows, and eventually, I could hear the distinct sound of someone's jeans rubbing together as they walked, and footsteps in the dry leaves. My windows were about 5 feet above my floor, so I could never see out of them as a kid without standing on a stool, which is also a fire hazard, but my dad would always tell me that he'd be installing bigger windows soon. I heard the person slightly bump into our trash bins, which were just outside our front door. Then, I heard the terrifying creak of our front door as it was pushed open slowly. Since we lived in the country, my parents never locked the doors. That's just how it was. I froze, petrified. I quickly looked to my sister, who was still sleeping peacefully, and gently nudged her to try and wake her up. She was a deep sleeper, and I didn't want to make too much noise, so I instead let her sleep. I knew it couldn't be my brother, so I texted my parents to ask if they had gotten home early. I figured that maybe my dad had just come in first, and that's why I only heard one person. At this point, I could hear the person shuffling things around in our mudroom and just walking around in there. I looked to my door and realised I hadn't locked it, as usual, and considered trying to get up and sneak to lock it. But what I heard next made me freeze. There was a vent that connected my room and the kitchen, and through it, I heard the person step into the kitchen and give a small sigh. I heard them open a couple of cupboards and open the fridge for a while. Finally, I got a text back from my dad. My stomach dropped when I read that they hadn't even started heading back to the house, and why I'd asked. My dad called me, and thank goodness I had my ringer off, but I decided to pick up anyways out of fear. I had turned my volume all the way down and spoke as quietly as I could. I told him that I thought there was someone in our house, and he freaked out and started asking questions, but I told him he had to be quiet because I was scared the person might be able to hear me. My parents stayed on the phone while they got in their car and started speeding back to our house. At this point, I asked them to mute themselves so that I could hear what was happening in the kitchen. That's when I realised that it had gotten really quiet. I heard one of the cupboards start to creak shut. Then light footsteps started to make their way towards my room. My heart pounded harder as I heard the person approach my door. I could see the slight shadow of their shoes underneath my door, but all they did was stand there. Scared that my parents would unmute themselves and I would be found, I hung up on them. It must have been a solid 30 seconds that the person stood there, not moving and not saying a word. Eventually, they just walked off. I heard them walk back through the kitchen, their jeans making the same sound as they rubbed together while they exited the house. I heard the leaves crunch once again as they retreated back into the forest, and the sound faded away. My parents got home probably 10 minutes later and stormed into the house, opening my door first and checking that I was safe. When I explained what happened, they doubted me and said I was probably just hearing house noises. Needless to say, from that night on, I locked my door religiously. I was always unsure to where he might have come from or walked back to, because even if you did walk through the forest, there weren't any more houses for nearly 2 miles. Though my siblings and I did find something in the woods when we explored it a couple of months later. There was a small shelter that someone had built out of rusty corrugated metal sheets and carpet squares. It had been flooded a little with water because of the marshy area of the woods it was in. There were a couple of empty alcohol bottles in it, but that was it. I'm glad I never had to face that person, but it still creeps me out to think that they might have heard me, but decided not to open my door anyways, and just left. I grew up in a small town in Alabama. A little bit after I graduated high school, when I was 18, I started dating this guy in his early 20s from a nearby city. He was very handsome, tall, muscular male that we'll call Sean for this story. He told me on our first date that he used to be part of a very well-known gang in the US. Sean explained that he'd only been a part of this gang in his younger years because he'd grown up in a bad area and hadn't really had any other options. He also did have proof in being in said gang, including being aware of gang signs associated with this said gang and having tattoos associated with that gang, which I did Google to see if the tattoos and gang signs were in fact associated with said gang, since I know there are some people who like to lie about being ex-gang members and the like for some reason to seem cool. Sean didn't seem like the type to lie about that. I gave Sean the benefit of the doubt because he didn't really give me any bad vibes. I remember he was always a gentleman to me and treated me very well. Of course, I didn't really suspect anything about him. We dated for a few weeks before the night that I found out the truth about him. I was staying over at Sean's apartment one night and everything was seeming pretty normal. This was the first time I'd ever stayed the night at his apartment, since I do tend to be a bit cautious. So regardless of his background, it wouldn't have mattered. I just don't really like staying over at people's homes until I get to know them a bit more. I do have an at least 3-day rule. I'd been too busy to really stay over at his place before that. So that night when I was staying over, Sean's best friend was visiting for a bit, and that's when the red flags started to show up. It did seem weird to have a friend over when the girl you are seeing is staying over for the first time. And it was revealed to me in private that Sean's friend was another ex-gang member from a well-known gang that is the enemy to the gang Sean had been a part of. Of course, I can accept people all have their backstories, but it was definitely just a weird thing to suddenly tell me out of the blue. Sean had not even told me his friend would be at the apartment that day in the first place. An additional note, Sean's friend did corroborate that he and Sean were both ex-gang members. After Sean's friend had left, we were hanging out in his room, and this guy had a literal arsenal in his room. I'm not exaggerating when I say he had enough weaponry to arm a small militia. This included things like grenades, bulletproof vests, an AK-47, or a gun similar to it. Needless to say, that was the second red flag of the day. That night, we were in bed together, and I can't remember what led him into revealing to me what he said in our conversation. He confessed to me that he was in fact still a part of the gang he had told me that he said he was out of. So, of course, I was immediately giving him this look like, I'm sorry, what? Then, he proceeded to go on and tell me that he actually was a hitman for the gang, and while he hadn't been active as a hitman as of late, he would still accept hits if they were given to him. The entire time he said this, he just looked dead in the eyes, with the most deadpan casual look, no feeling in his eyes, and spoke like he was talking about the weather. It was extremely creepy, and I knew right then that this guy was a straight up psychopath. I don't doubt that he was lying. I've met people who try and get clout by lying about things like this, and he was definitely not one of those types. I did stay the rest of the night and then left the next morning and never talked to him again. I was definitely not going to keep on dating someone like that. There's not really anything to the story after that. He never really tried to contact me afterwards. I'm sure some people will probably wonder why I didn't just leave right after he told me that he was a hitman. I didn't think it was a good idea to react strongly and immediately storm out of the apartment. I also didn't actually feel like he was a danger to me personally, but he definitely had the vibe of someone who would kill people. The reason why I recognise that kind of vibe is another story. He was always very polite to me, but regardless, there was no way I was going to keep dating him, no matter how hot I thought he was.